It started as a typical summer morning at the Beachside Holiday Park. It was January 21st. The setting was Mount Monganui, a place usually associated with tranquility, holidays, and the slow pace of coastal living. But that peace was shattered in a way that is difficult to fully comprehend. At 9:30 a.m., the Earth moved. In less than 60 seconds, barely enough time to draw a breath and realize what was happening, a massive section of Mount Mauo's slope detached. A colossal volume of mud, ancient soil, and debris roared down the mountainside, obliterating the campground below. In that brief, violent minute, 6 lives were lost. When we look back at an event like this, it's easy to call it an act of God. It's easy to point to the sky and blame the rain. And yes, the immediate trigger was meteorological, a record-breaking deluge that soaked the land to its breaking point. But if you dig deeper, if you peel back the layers of mud and bureaucracy, you find a different story. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a tragedy manufactured by a collision of factors: a geological loaded gun, a series of missed warning signs, and a critical breakdown in human decision-making. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through a comprehensive post-mortem of this disaster. We'll look at the science of why the mountain fell, the timeline of the 4 hours that could have saved lives, and the legal and social storm that has followed in the wake of the landslide. The analysis suggests a hard truth. The rain pulled the trigger, but a gap in our safety systems is what allowed the disaster to happen. Part 1. The science of the collapse. To understand why this happened, we have to look beyond the storm itself. We need to look underground. This disaster is what experts call a compound event. It wasn't one thing going wrong. It was multiple physical factors converging to overwhelm the strength of the hillside. The trigger. When the ground acts like a sponge, let's start with the water. The rainfall on January 21st wasn't just heavy. It was historic. The region recorded 274 millimeters of rain in a single 24-hour period. To put that into perspective, imagine a significant portion of the region's entire annual rainfall being dumped onto the mountain in just one day. Geotechnically speaking, the soil reached a state of critical saturation. Think of the mountain's soil like a kitchen sponge. A sponge can hold water, but only up to a certain point. Its field capacity. Once you go past that, the water has nowhere to go. On that day, the intensity of the storm completely overwhelmed the soil's ability to drain. As the water pushed into the ground, it filled the tiny spaces between soil particles. This created something called pore water pressure. Imagine the water acting like a hydraulic jack, effectively pushing the soil particles apart and reducing the friction that holds the slope together. When that internal pressure gets too high, gravity wins. The slope simply lets go. It is crucial to note that investigators checked the seismic data. Sensors from GeoNet confirmed there was absolutely no earthquake activity. The ground didn't shake from tectonic plates. It failed because it was simply too heavy with water and lost its cohesion. On the mechanism, the hidden weakness. But why did it fail there specifically? Forensic geologists found the culprit, a weak layer hidden inside the mountain. The landslide didn't happen randomly. It slid along a specific fatal flaw, a 0.7-meter thick layer of something called colluvium. Colluvium isn't solid rock. It's a loose, messy collection of sediment that has piled up over centuries from rainwash and slow creep. Unlike the bedrock, it has very little structural integrity. This layer was sandwiched between 2 ancient scar areas. This tells us that Mount Mauo has fallen before. The mountain had a history of instability. On the morning of January 21st, that layer of colluvium essentially turned into a layer of ball bearings. Once it was lubricated by that massive rainfall, the land above it had nothing to hold on to. The physics, speed, and volume. The sheer physics of the collapse explain why the fatality rate was so high. We are talking about 380,000 cubic meters of material. That number is hard to visualize, so think of it this way. That is roughly equivalent to 150 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled with mud, trees, and rock, all moving at once. And it was moving fast. The debris flow reached speeds of 60 to 80 kilometers per hour. That might not sound supersonic, but in a confined space it is terrifying. At that speed, the wall of mud covers 16 meters every single second. For the residents in the campground, the math was against them. Even if they heard the roar of the collapse, their reaction time was virtually non-existent. From the moment the slope detached to the moment the campground was buried, less than 1 minute passed. There was simply no margin for escape. Part 2. The anatomy of a warning failure. If the geology explains the how, the timeline explains the why regarding the loss of life. This is the most distressing part of the investigation. We call it the fatal window, a specific period of time where the warning signs were flashing, but no decisive action was taken. The Sentinel event. The disaster didn't strike out of the blue. There was a warning shot. At 5:47 a.m., nearly 4 hours before the main collapse, a smaller slip occurred on the lower slopes. It actually hit a camper van. A resident, Lisa McLennan, actively alerted others. This was a sentinel event. It was nature waving a red flag, clearly indicating that the slope was active, unstable, and dangerous. The 4-hour gap. This brings us to the institutional response lag, and this is where the system became paralyzed. At 5:50 a.m., just 3 minutes after that first slip, Fire and Emergency NZ and the Tanga City Council were notified via a 111 call. So before 6 a.m., authorities knew there was slope instability in a populated area during a record rainfall event. Fast forward to 8:56 a.m., the council made a decision. They decided to close the walking tracks around Mao. Now, pause and think about the implications of that decision. It is the critical pivot point of this entire tragedy. By closing the tracks, the council formally acknowledged that the risk of a landslide was high enough to threaten hikers. They knew it wasn't safe to walk there, and yet the campground remained open. This creates a baffling, heartbreaking contradiction in safety protocol. If the mountain was considered too dangerous to walk on, why was it considered safe to sleep under? This points to a serious issue with siloed decision-making. It suggests a total disconnect between the departments managing recreational tracks and those overseeing residential safety. There was no protocol that linked the two. There was no automatic trigger that said, if the tracks are unsafe, get the campers out. The risk assessment was localized when it needed to be holistic. The catastrophe. And then came 9:30 a.m. The main collapse occurred. The amenities block, the cabins, and the people inside were buried. That 4-hour window, from 5:50 to 9:30, was a window of opportunity where an orderly evacuation could have saved every single life. Instead, that time was consumed by observation rather than action. The failure wasn't that they didn't have the information. The failure was that they didn't synthesize that information into a clear directive to protect the public. Part 3. The aftermath. Silence, law, and sorrow. The tragedy at Mount Monganui didn't end when the earth stopped moving. The post-disaster phase has been defined by a desperate struggle for answers, a search for accountability, and the complex reality of managing a site that is now a mass grave, a crime scene, and a sacred ancestor. The data vacuum. One of the biggest sources of public frustration has been the lack of transparency. There is a sense of a data vacuum. Key scientific datasets, things like LiDAR scans that map the ground's topology, ground-penetrating radar profiles, and specific geotechnical reports, have been withheld or heavily redacted. The consequence of this secrecy is damaging. It fuels conspiracy theories and erodes the public's trust in their local government. Independent scientists can't peer-review the official findings because they can't see the raw data. And for the families of the victims, it leaves a lingering question. Are these unknowns being kept secret to protect privacy, or are they being used to shield liability? They want to know if that 0.7-meter weak layer was something the council should have fixed years ago. The legal storm. Naturally, this has triggered a massive legal response. The Tanga City Council launched an independent review, but let's be honest, internal reviews are often viewed with skepticism. Can you ever truly investigate yourself? More importantly, WorkSafe New Zealand has stepped in. This is pivotal. It reframes the disaster. It's no longer just a natural event. It's potentially a workplace health and safety failure. The campground is a business. The council is a land manager. Under New Zealand law, they have a duty of care to take all practicable steps to ensure safety. If the investigations prove that the risk was known, perhaps via those ancient scar identifications, and was ignored, this moves from simple negligence to potential criminal liability. The cultural dilemma. On the ground, the recovery operation faced a profound ethical and cultural dilemma. It was a clash between safety and recovery. With the slope remaining unstable, operations even had to pause on January 26 due to new cracks appearing. Rescuers had to balance the desperate need to return bodies to their families against the risk of creating more victims among the rescue crew. Furthermore, Mount Monganui is a site of deep significance to local iwi. The destruction of the land and the loss of life imposes a rahui, a ritual restriction. The land is now tapu, or sacred and prohibited. This complicates everything. It raises difficult questions about whether the campground can or should ever reopen. Part 4. Lessons for a Volatile Future. So, where do we go from here? The Mount Monganui landslide is a microcosm of a global challenge. It forces us to confront a hard reality. The static risk management strategies of the 20th century are failing in the dynamic volatility of the 21st. The climate reality first, we must acknowledge that our landscapes are being pushed beyond their historical limits. Climate change means that a slope that was stable for 50 years is no longer guaranteed to be stable tomorrow. We are entering a new regime of record-breaking rainfall events that happen with terrifying frequency. The lesson here is clear. Historic stability is not a guarantee of future safety. Hazard maps based on 100-year averages are obsolete. Our planning must account for extreme volatility. Ending passive management. Second, the response at Mount Monganui was passive. The authorities waited for the disaster to escalate before they reacted. That has to change. We need what experts call active trigger protocols. We need to remove the human hesitation factor. It should be binary. If rainfall exceeds X amount in Y hours, evacuation is automatic. If a sentinel slip occurs, evacuation is automatic. We cannot rely on meetings and discussions during a crisis. The ambiguity during that 5:50 a.m. to 8:56 a.m. window cost lives. In binary protocols, if this happens, then we do that. Save lives. The crisis of communication. And finally, we have to talk about how we communicate. The lack of a siren or a mass mobile alert was a critical infrastructure failure. Warning systems must be aggressive and redundant. Relying on officials to physically drive to a site during a storm to see what's happening is inefficient and dangerous. Digital alerting systems and physical sirens need to be integrated directly into campground and park infrastructure, specifically in these high-risk zones. Conclusion. In summary, the Mount Monganui landslide paints a picture of a tragedy that was, at least partially, preventable. The science confirms the mountain was primed to fail. The weak point was there. The saturation was there. But the human response confirms that our systems for managing these risks are woefully inadequate. 6 lives were lost. They weren't just lost to mud and rain. They were lost to a 4-hour delay in decision-making and a bureaucratic inability to connect the dots between a small slip and a looming catastrophe. As the legal battles regarding transparency and liability continue, the ultimate legacy of Mount Monganui must be a radical overhaul. We need to rethink how we monitor, manage, and respect the unstable land we live upon. In an era of climate extremes, hoping for the best is no longer a strategy. Only rigorous, data-driven, and proactive risk management can prevent the next disaster.